Hey, my name is Brendon Chung. We're in a small independent company called Blendo Games. Today I'm going to talk about how to use level design architecture for navigation and storytelling. So I'll start with a little bit about myself. I started with mod work, and that led to working as a designer at a AAA company, and that led to returning to my little personal games and making my own little company called Blendo Games. I've worked on third-person games, strategy games, first-person games, so I feel very fortunate to have been exposed to all these, diverse group of games. So at Blendo Games, I wear all the hats. I do all the design, I do all the art, and I do the programming and the business stuff. So at the moment, I'm a one-person company with one person doing porting work. So this talk focuses on how to convey information through level design architecture. We'll cover a few things. So player navigation, level readability, and storytelling. One of the most helpful design exercises I learned was from the lead level designer from a project that I worked on. The way he had us design was to take the level that you're working on and strip out all the UI. Remove the objective marker, remove the minimap, remove the little magic compass, remove all of that stuff. And we found that when we removed all of those things, it made us realize kind of how much we'd been using these tools as this crutch. Suddenly things like sight lines and landmarks and pathways and lighting became so much more important. And this forced us to become more creative to find design solutions. And it meant a lot of things. The level itself had to guide the player to navigate it and to not get lost. It meant we had to make traveling through the world as intuitive as possible. So in order to achieve this, the world had to be instantly readable. And what I mean by readable is it clear what that something, is it clear what it's trying to say, and is it saying that thing clearly? Whoa. So I have animated GIFs, but apparently they're really freaking out, so sorry about that. So there are many things that can cause friction in readability, and one of those things is depth perception. So in the picture here, the player is standing on a platform. Pretend this is a first-person perspective. The person's on the platform. The player might be able to make this jump, question mark. When playing from the first-person or over-the-shoulder perspective, the depth perception becomes really difficult to judge. Whereas here's the exact same geometry, but from the side view. And from the side view, it's dead obvious, what the distance between the platform is. This is kind of why traditional platformer games use this side view perspective, because it's incredibly easy to judge distance. And so here's one of the ways that depth perception causes friction. From the first-person perspective, this space looks like it could either be a hallway or it might be a dead end. But then from the map editor point of view, it's clearly a hallway with a bend in it. So when I'm making a map, I spend a ridiculous amount of time just wiggling the camera back and forth and just kind of simulating, how it'll look to the player when they're actually in the engine. But it's areas like this that kind of make it really clear that, that it's important to not just stay in the editor the entire time. You got to jump into the engine and check it out. Because while from the top-down editor view, this place looks fine. It's a little elbow bend, no problem. But in the game itself, this area becomes really problematic. So I'm going to get a little bit touchy-feely here. I want to stress that the problem here is not that this hallway is confusing. And the major problem here is that things like this prevent the player from moving through the level with confidence. These are the little things that kind of make the player second-guess themselves and kind of gives them that little nagging sense of uncertainty when they're moving through your level. So I feel that the cleanest way to tell a story or to tell a joke is with as few moving parts as possible. And I feel the exact same thing applies to level design. Like for this space is really ambiguous as to whether it's an intersection or a dead end. Whereas on the top-down view, is clearly, a T intersection. So when a level has a space like this, it's adding this unnecessary moving part to your level. is clutter, it's noise. It's an unnecessary wrinkle to the level architecture. So this hallway makes a few changes in an attempt to kind of make itself more instantly readable. There's a slight 45-degree bend added to it. And this little bend hints that this hall connects to an adjoining passage. There's an elevation change. So by raising the player's viewpoint, this kind of grants the player a better vantage point, and the distance between things becomes easier to judge. And this alleviates some issues with the depth perception. And the passage is also given a light source at the very end. If you look in the 2D editor, it's that little tiny dot to the top of the image. And this light source serves to draw the eye toward it and kind of makes the passage more inviting. And the hall also has a really tiny cutout at the end that gives a glimpse into the next room. And this kind of removes, if there was any doubt, this tries to remove all doubt that there is in another area beyond this hallway. And I want to make it clear again that I'm not trying to advocate that every hallway has to be made like this, in this very, very specific way. This is not about hallways. I think what it comes down to is being mindful of what you want your space to say versus what it actually ends up saying in the engine. In this example, the layout of this space kind of obscures the side passage. So the GIF is this guy walking down a hallway, and to your left is a passage that is completely obscured. The player, they'd probably find this passage eventually. But the point here is that the geography of this space is not easily readable. And Joel here had the suggestion of kind of playing through your level layout backwards, and I think that is really a great method. I found that when I'm playtesting my stuff, I kind of end up accidentally doing that, and I found that seeing your architecture from an unexpected and unplanned angle is a really effective way to troubleshoot problem areas and kind of see it with fresh eyes. Because when you are the person making your level, you know every detail, but when you walk backwards, it's like, who made this level? And it's really interesting to kind of see it from that perspective. So the level is constructed in such a way that hallways look like hallways and not like dead ends. It standardizes dimensions so that a doorway is instantly readable as a doorway, and a table is instantly readable as a table. And it's made in such a way that when you see an obstacle, you can instantly read whether it can be jumped over or whether it's going to block your progress. And so the level is constantly asking, what the player does and does not have line of sight to. Ask, why are we giving the player line of sight to this thing right now, and why are we denying the player line of sight to that thing over there right now? Before we go a little bit deeper, I want to take a moment to mention that everything that has been discussed so far about all this readability and sightlines and standardization of stuff, I want to stress that these concepts are for a very specific kind of level design and for a very specific kind of game. Depending on what you're trying to make, your game might very well benefit the most from doing the exact opposite of everything that I'm talking about. So I want to make clear that this is not about universal truths in level design. So I definitely encourage you to not take this talk at face value. And so there are times in which the game needs the player to see specific things. And the challenge is, if the player can be anywhere in the map and doing anything at any given time, how does the game kind of steer the player's viewpoint to a specific location? So there are many tools that the player can use to kind of infuse this into the level. And some of the examples are ladders and buttons and pathways. So when the player is on a ladder, the game has a very clear idea of the player position and the direction that the player is facing. One of the classic examples of this is from Monolith Sphere. In this sequence, the protagonist climbs up a ladder, and the game, exploits this opportunity by placing this spooky jump scare at a place where the player is guaranteed to be looking. So every time the player plays this, the game exploits the fact that the ladder is the player. The game knows exactly that the player is going to be looking straight ahead, and they're going to be, climbing upwards. And when they mount this ladder, they're going to be, looking in this very, very specific direction. And they put a little spooky girl there. The same thing is true when the player presses a button. At that moment, the game knows very well where the player is and what direction that they are facing. An example of this is Valve's Half-Life, and the protagonist presses a button, and they're treated to this big spectacle payoff of seeing this tentacle creature being burnt alive. And the button and the viewing area are oriented in such a way that the player is guaranteed to watch the spectacle without. They're guaranteed to watch the spectacle, but it doesn't force them to watch it. And the level geometry itself steers the player. This is my favorite thing. And whenever the player climbs a ramp or walks through a doorway, that ramp or that doorway is nudging the player toward a certain direction. An example of a combination of these things are the elevators from Irrational's, BioShock Infinite. The protagonist enters the elevator, they literally punch the button, and by steering the camera toward the button, this gives the AI character, Elizabeth, the opportunity to kind of seamlessly transition into the elevator. And the elevator doors themselves, they give the player a very, very clear indicator, for what direction to look at. So to further expand on that, let's take a moment to talk about, kind of building anticipation through level geometry. So one way to build anticipation is to constantly give the player glimpses to an unreachable area. And what I mean by that is, as the player kind of moves toward the destination, the level provides a series of vantage points to the destination area. So in a way, this kind of teases the player, kind of helps create this mental map of the destination area's layout. But most importantly, it makes the destination a very tangible goal. It makes it something that the player can clearly see and clearly hear. So we'll use the space from Gravity Bone as an example. So the player starts in a room, and they enter this corridor. And the door is angled in such a way that when the player opens it, their viewpoint is immediately steered toward a large window. So by doing this, the door kind of guarantees that the player sees what's through the window, kind of sees what you want them to see. And the player can see the destination through the window. The window, it physically blocks the player from accessing the destination, but it gives an introduction to the area from a very safe vantage point. So the player is then led to this outside area, and here they're given another vantage point of the destination. So by reminding the player through these vantage points, the level reinforces the player's sense of geography. It gives the player an understanding of where things are and how different areas lie in relation to one another. So I'm going to take a moment to talk about Die Hard. So early in the movie, Die Hard, policeman Al Powell is attacked by the bad guys. He slams his car in reverse. The police car goes full speed off this little ledge and ends up in this really awkward leaning position, kind of off this little ravine over here. And then the movie goes on. Stuff happens. There's a police standoff. There's lots of action. And then much later in the movie, the FBI arrive on the scene. And then something really wonderful happens. The FBI climb up a hill, and they pass by Al Powell's awkward police car. And I say that this is wonderful because it gives the world of Die Hard a really strong sense of geography. There are very specific locations in the Die Hard universe, and Al Powell's car is one of those locations. So by giving this very, very specific shot of Al Powell's car, the movie reminds us about this much in the same way that giving very specific vantage points in your level kind of reminds the player of your world's geography. So back to the previous example. The player is led to the destination, and as they are being led there, their viewpoint is kind of clamped toward the destination itself, because when they're moving forward, they're kind of forced to look at this place. And then finally, the player arrives at the destination. So there's a few things happening here. By giving the player these multiple glimpses at the destination, the level builds up anticipation. It also helps the player kind of create this mental map of the area. And finally, it makes it really clear what the player's goal is. The player enters the area, they understand what the goal is, and they have to figure out how to reach that goal. This is dependent on what kind of game you're making. But for this example, the challenge for the player wasn't figuring out how to solve something and not what that something is. So much like how the level itself can convey navigational cues, it likewise can convey cues about the world's history, the setting, and the characters. So as an example, this hideout area is filled with a variety of items. The items were chosen to each say something. The blueprints on the wall, they kind of signify a level of preparedness and planning. In the previous room prior to this, the player learns about the game universe's prohibition laws. So by having boxes of alcohol here, it kind of signifies a criminal element. And the rifle and the box of bullets clue us in and how this group of people kind of approach the problems. And here we have a chalkboard displaying some sort of plan for an operation. The place is a bit of a mess. There are many boxes of rolled up blueprints, and these things kind of suggest that the group has been here for a while. And when the level takes this approach, the player kind of has to figure out things for themselves. The player is engaged. The player is involved in the process. And the player has to make their own connections and come up with their own conclusions. There's a saying that the director, Billy Wilder, was fond of saying, if you let the audience add up 2 + 2 so it equals 4, they will love you forever. So I wanted to end with a really brief note about airports, amusement parks, casinos, and IKEA. When I walk through certain places, I try to see things through the lens of a level designer. And by that, I mean I kind of run this thought exercise. The thought exercise is, when I get lost, it is never my fault. I wash myself of all responsibility. It doesn't matter if I made a horrible mistake. It's not my fault. If a place is designed for people and I end up getting lost or I'm not sure where to go, then the place has failed. I blame the design. I don't blame myself. And so the purpose of this is to try to work out how I would have designed the place differently. And the beauty of this is that the real world has, constructed and prototyped a bunch of level design for you. There is no UI. There is no objective marker. The world trusts you. It trusts you to make connections on your own. And when you feel that trust, you feel respected. When you're designing your level and you use architecture to guide the player through it, and you're putting a lot of trust in the player. And when the player feels that trust, they feel respected. Thank you. Cool. If you're sticking around, please get your badge scanned. There will be CAs walking around. And if there's any Q questions, please go to the microphones.
What are some of the techniques? Hello. Can you guys hear me?
Oh, can I get the microphone turned on, please?
Quiet. No? Should I just yell? There we go. So when you're using these techniques to guide players over and over throughout your levels, what are some of the things you do to make them less apparent and less, like, give your levels a sense that not every hallway turns just like that and shows you the next room? How do you disguise that?
Well, I mean, I guess I'll put the question back to you. Like, when you see these things, do you feel you are being manipulated? And do you feel like the hand of the designer kind of like tricking you to do certain things?
I felt that way sometimes before. And I feel like in some games they do a really good job of guiding me towards something without me realizing that I'm being guided. And in other games I get the sense that every space that has the same like travel goals is shaped the same way.
Right, right. I mean, I guess for me, I just try to I try to be conscious of what I'm doing and to not, play the same trick over and over again. To just, as you build more and more levels, your toolbox gets bigger and bigger, and just you get to just try out different things and be more diverse in what you're doing.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, hi. Edwin McRae, narrative designer, Path of Exile. What I'm really interested in is the weight that you put on visual design as far as conveying story, character, theme, and all of those sort of things. So what sort of principles do you have in mind for getting a story across purely through environment and visuals?
Yeah. So the question is, what's the process of kind of getting story and things like that across through just visuals? And I guess for me, it kind of comes down to what I mentioned very early on, is to just have that really hard limitation of no UI, and then work from there, which is, and I guess once you have these really, really hard restrictions, it kind of puts you in a different mindset. And you start noticing how do other things do it, and how, what are ways to kind of sorry, I'm blacking out.
I'll actually jump in and I'll do it with you up here.
Sure.
Expanding on something that Brendon was talking about with the heist room, a lot of that stuff is sort of casually baked into an environment. Brendon actually does this better than many people do, right? Where all of that stuff has a level of implication. And I think one of the things when you're building any space is literally every decision has meaning. If you take a gray box space that has no textures, the minute that you throw brick on there versus space tiles already starts to say something about what it is. So I think a lot of it comes down to just being cognizant about those choices and the impact that they're actually going to have.
Yeah. If you have access to GDC 20, the last year's Vault, there's a really great talk made from the artist on The Witness. And the process of making art on The Witness is this very, very involved process of this building is made of these really, really large bricks. And so how did they get these bricks up here? There had to be some sort of ramp of some sort. And what quarry did those bricks come from? Was it from this island? Then there needs to be a quarry there. Was it, from a boat? Then there needs to be a dock, and there needs to be a path from the dock to this, this building that's being made. Yeah, so it's just really being really critical about yourself and not just building for building's sake.
So just to add on that a little bit, so would you recommend, say, if you're building an area, think about the story and how that can be portrayed through the visuals before putting in any non-player characters or dialogue, as well as UI, just strip it right back, and then only add in that sort of stuff to basically fill in the gaps?
So my process is very not recommended. What I do is I polish as I go, and I'll make every art final as I'm grayboxing. I kind of spend as little time as possible on grayboxing, put in final art, because I find that when you put in final art as quickly as you humanly can, it forces you to make these decisions just on the fly. And I find that, I find that when I grayboxed and then put in final art, I found that it didn't quite come together as well for me. Whereas like when I'm being put to the wall of like, all right, I put in a final art barrel here. Now I need to figure out, why is this barrel here? And now I need to put in this next art asset that justifies this barrel. And then that kind of snowballs out to other thing. And then before you know it, the level is done.
Cool. Thanks, Brandon.
Hey.
If you're calling older games, occasionally there'd be secrets that behind a wall or something at a strike to find. What do you feel about like totally hidden secrets? And should there be some loose guidance? Like, what is your view on how hidden something should be in a level?
I don't know. I mean, it depends on what kind of game you're trying to make. I personally take the approach of, it depends on how you're viewing your game. I know some games, you want the player to experience every bit of content. And so for those games, it makes way more sense to hide your secrets, but not really hide them. They're just incredibly easy to find. For me personally, I like it when a thing is there and just does not really make any attention to it, does not really call any attention to itself. I like it when when a friend is playing a game and they tell me, did you see this thingamajig in this game? And I say, I had no idea that was there. And there's something exciting about that. There's something that it's kind of that gag of like having tons of locked doors in your level, and it just makes the level seem way bigger than it actually is.
Thank you.
Basically, I just wanted to kind of go back to the very beginning of your topic about getting rid of those kind of flashy UI pieces, the giant arrow that's pointing to the target or something like that. And I guess I'm just wondering, is what you're saying generally taking the UI, making it less obvious, building it into the level itself? So making the corridors actually highlight, hey, this is the way you want to go, as opposed to an arrow saying, go that way.
Yeah, I personally don't think that UI is inherently bad or evil. And I think it works just fine in many games. I think for me, what I was talking about is more about building your level without that stuff. And then when you do later on put in your UI, it acts not as the primary way of navigating your level, but more of a, if you do get lost, this is something you can fall back on.
Cool. Thanks.
Hi. I had a question regarding the level design, the boundaries of the level. There are a couple of different ways to go about doing the boundaries of a level. One being like there is a hard boundary, being architecture, like you mentioned, or the unfortunate invisible wall. And then there are soft boundaries, which are more often, it's boring to go this way, like when you see a beach and you can go out in the water and you kind of lose interest or maybe stop moving. Or if you move behind a building and realize that there is absolutely nothing behind the last 3 buildings you went behind, so you stop going behind buildings. Do you find it more rewarding and effective to use hard boundaries in a level, or is there some reason you might want to use soft boundaries, or do you have to decide based on what the project is?
I think for me, the most important thing in terms of boundaries is just making it fit in the world and just making it logically, make sense. Like when levels do have that, very, very tiny bar counter that you just can't jump over, that doesn't make sense because anyone could jump over a bar counter. But as long as it fictionally fits, I think that, that's, for me at least, that's the most important criteria.
Do you think it's all rewarding for the player to find out where the boundary is just by going too far, or do you think you risk losing them because they're now becoming bored?
For me, it needs to be as clear and obvious as possible. Because I think for me, finding the boundary of a place is not, at least for the games that I'm interested in making, that's not really what I want the game to be, about, or to spend a lot of time on. Because I think time is a very finite resource, and if you burn it on this thing, that's something that you can never gain back from the player.
Cool. Thank you.
All right, we'll take a couple of minutes to let the AV crew set up for the next talk, and then we'll get going in 2 or 3 minutes.
All right.